The afternoon sun was beginning to fade behind a row of tall buildings when Officer Daniel stepped out of his patrol car, his face tight with worry. People walked past him on the sidewalk, unaware of the storm building inside him. His son had been missing for 3 hours. 3 long, unbearable hours. And every passing minute made the fear in his chest grow heavier. He tried to stay calm, but his hand shook slightly as he spoke to the officers around him, giving instructions, asking questions, hoping for any lead at all. But nothing came. No sightings, no clues, no trail, just silence. He kept replaying the last moment. He saw his boy, the way he'd smiled, the way he'd waved before running toward the playground. It didn't make sense. Kids didn't just disappear like that. Not in the middle of a crowded park. Not without someone seeing something. But here he was, living the nightmare every parent fears, and he could feel his strength slipping. Even as an officer, even with years of training, he felt helpless. Today, he wasn't a cop. He was just a father searching for his child. Then, as he turned toward the small group of people who had gathered to help, he noticed a little girl standing a few steps away, holding a leash tightly in her small hand. Her police dog, an off-duty K-9 named Ranger, stood beside her, alert but calm. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. She had wide, steady eyes that didn't look away when he met them. Instead, she stepped forward with a confidence that didn't fit her size. "Officer, my police dog can find your son." Her voice was soft but certain, and for a moment, everyone fell completely silent. Daniel blinked, unsure if he had heard her right. The girl looked up at him, one hand resting gently on Ranger's head. She wasn't scared. She wasn't guessing. She was sure. The dog beside her lifted his nose slightly, sniffing the air as if he understood exactly what she had said. Daniel knelt down so he could look her in the eye. "Sweetheart, what did you say?" She took a small step closer. "Ranger can help. He's really good at finding people. He found my cousin when he got lost last year, and he found a woman in the forest before the storm came. He can do it again. He can find your son." Her words hit him harder than she could have imagined. The girl's calm confidence felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. But part of him hesitated. Ranger was a trained police dog, yes, but he wasn't on duty today, and trusting a child with something so serious felt impossible. Still, her certainty was so strong, so direct, that he felt a flicker of hope for the first time all day. A fragile hope, but real. The other officers looked at each other, unsure how to respond, but nobody dismissed her. There was something almost grounding about the way she stood there, steady, determined, like she had already decided the dog would succeed. Ranger's ears twitched, and he stepped forward on his own, giving Daniel a small nudge with his nose, almost as if he were making a decision for him. Daniel took a long breath, trying to process everything. "Your dog. He really found people before?" The girl nodded quickly. "Yes, and he's been restless since we got here. He keeps smelling the air like he knows something's wrong." She looked down at Ranger, then back up with a seriousness far beyond her years. "Please, just let him try." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, not from fear, but from the weight of wanting to help. Daniel felt something shift inside him. The officers had already searched the nearby streets and talked to witnesses. They were running out of places to look. Maybe this dog really could find something they couldn't. But before he could say anything, Ranger suddenly pulled gently on the leash, his nose going low to the ground. The girl tightened her grip, but didn't stop him. The dog gave a small whine, sharp, focused, almost urgent. Everyone turned to watch him as he paced in a slow circle, sniffing carefully, his body tensing with interest. "See," the girl whispered. "He smells something." Daniel's heart started pounding. Maybe this was the moment something would finally change. Maybe they had a chance. As he watched Ranger move, he felt a strange mix of fear and hope twisting inside him. If the dog didn't find anything, he would fall right back into the same darkness. But if he did, the girl loosened the leash, letting Ranger stretch forward, and that's when the dog suddenly jerked his head toward a line of trees at the edge of the park. His body stiffened, tail raised, nose pointed forward. A low, determined rumble came from his chest. It wasn't aggression. It was the deep signal every trained K-9 handler recognized. He had caught a scent. The girl looked up at Daniel with wide eyes. He found the trail. The officers around him straightened, stepping closer, watching Ranger with growing attention. Daniel felt his breath catch. This was the first real sign of direction they had all day. He stood up, his voice barely steady, as he turned toward his team. Get ready to follow him. Stay close. But before anyone could make the first move, Ranger took a slow step toward the trees, nose low, body focused, then suddenly stopped. Every muscle in his body froze. His ears flicked, his head tilted slightly left, then right. Then he looked up, locking eyes with Daniel. It wasn't confusion. It was warning. Before Daniel could ask what the dog sensed, a rustling sound echoed from somewhere deep within the trees. It wasn't loud, but was enough to make every officer's hand move toward their gear out of reflex. The girl swallowed, gripping the leash tightly even though Ranger was now standing perfectly still. Something, or someone, was already watching them from inside the shadows. And in that moment, Daniel realized finding the trail might be the easy part. What waited at the end of it could change everything. The dog let out one sharp bark, loud, urgent, almost commanding, and then he pulled the girl toward the trees with more force than before. Daniel took off after them, fear and hope racing through him at the exact same speed. Because whatever Ranger had sensed, it wasn't just his missing son. It was something else. Something none of them were prepared for, and the truth waiting ahead was about to shock everyone. Ranger moved ahead with careful steps, pulling the little girl with just enough strength to show urgency, but not enough to scare her. The officers followed close behind, with Daniel right at the front, his eyes locked on the shadows between the trees. The park had always looked peaceful in the daytime, full of children and families, but now, as the sun dipped lower, everything felt different. The colors dimmed, the air thickened, and even the wind seemed to quiet itself. It was the kind of silence that made every small sound feel louder than it should. Daniel tried to steady his breathing. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. His son was still missing, and now this dog, this off-duty police dog, had picked up a trail that led straight to a part of the park most people avoided after dark. He glanced at the little girl. Despite her age, she didn't look frightened. If anything, she looked focused, like she had been through tough situations before and trusted Ranger completely. How long has he been trained? Daniel asked softly as they slowed near the first line of trees. Since he was a puppy, she whispered. My dad trained him. He said Ranger has a special sense for people who need help. Daniel nodded, though her answer sparked new questions. A special sense wasn't something he could put on a report, but right now, he didn't need explanations. He needed results. The officer spread out slightly, giving Ranger space to work. The dog sniffed along the ground, weaving between roots and fallen leaves, his tail stiff and straight. As they stepped deeper into the wooded area, the temperature seemed to drop. The tall trees blocked the remaining sunlight, creating an uneven darkness around them. Daniel could hear the crunch of leaves under their boots and the soft, steady breath of the girl as she kept pace with Ranger. The dog paused, sniffing at a patch of dirt near the base of an old tree. He lingered longer than before, and Daniel felt his heart jump. Is that something? He asked. The girl knelt beside Ranger, watching him closely. He's thinking, she said quietly. Sometimes he stops like this when he's trying to understand the scent. Daniel watched the dog's nose move in small circles. Ranger gave a short, low sound, not a bark, not a growl, just a kind of rumble from his chest. Then he suddenly lifted his head, sniffed the air, and turned sharply to the right. Follow him, Daniel said, and the team adjusted their formation. Ranger pulled them toward a narrow path that looked barely used. The branches overhead hung low, and the ground was uneven. The girl stumbled once, but she didn't let go of the leash. She kept whispering something under her breath. Maybe encouragement, maybe instructions Ranger already understood. As they moved farther, Daniel noticed something strange. The deeper they went, the more he felt like they were being watched. Not by animals, this was different. It was a quiet, heavy presence, like someone was standing just out of sight. The officers must have felt it too because they grew tense, their steps slowing, their eyes scanning the trees. Even the birds seemed to avoid this part of the park. Ranger stopped again, this time more abruptly. He lowered himself close to the ground, muscles tight. The girl froze beside him. "What's wrong?" Daniel whispered, but she didn't answer at first. She studied Ranger's body, the way his ears moved, the way his eyes narrowed. "He smells someone," she finally said. "Someone close." One of the officers signaled for silence. They all listened, breath held, hearts pounding. For a moment, there was nothing, and then a soft rustling sound, somewhere ahead, too soft to be footsteps, too slow to be someone running. Just a movement, faint but unmistakable. Daniel took a step forward, but Ranger suddenly moved in front of him, blocking him with his body. The dog's hackles weren't raised, but his stance was protective. The girl grabbed the leash tightly. "He doesn't want you going first," she whispered. Daniel swallowed. Ranger wasn't her dog alone. He was a trained K9. If he sensed danger, they had to respect it. Daniel gave a small nod, and the officers eased back a little, giving the dog room. Ranger moved forward, inch by inch, his nose low but his eyes fixed ahead. The girl followed carefully, and Daniel stayed close behind her. Every part of him wanted to run forward to find his son, but he forced himself to stay calm. Rushing him blindly could ruin everything. They reached a small clearing, one Daniel didn't even know existed. Broken branches lay scattered around, and patches of disturbed soil hinted that someone had passed through recently. Ranger sniffed the ground, then walked toward a low bush at the edge of the clearing. He stopped in front of it and stared. Daniel's pulse quickened. He stepped forward, but again, Ranger blocked him gently. "Why does he keep doing that?" Daniel whispered, frustration and fear tightening his voice. The girl hesitated, as if choosing her words. "He's protecting you," she said. Ranger only blocks someone when he thinks they're about to step into something unsafe. Daniel's chest tightened. The idea that danger was close enough for Ranger to act this way, sent a fresh wave of fear through him. He crouched down beside the dog, trying to see what Ranger saw. The bush rustled slightly, just a soft tremor, not from wind but from something inside it. "Is someone there?" Daniel called softly, trying not to sound threatening. "If you can hear me, we're not here to hurt anyone." There was no answer, just the same faint movement. Ranger's body went rigid. The girl squeezed the leash. Daniel reached a hand slowly toward the branches, but before he could touch them, Ranger snapped his head up toward the trees behind them. His body spun sharply, positioning himself between the group and the direction he was staring. His bark echoed through the woods, sharp, urgent, and clearly a warning. The officers turned instantly, hands ready, scanning the shadows. Daniel felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Whoever, or whatever, Ranger had sensed wasn't in front of them anymore. It was behind them. "Stay close to me," Daniel whispered to the girl, guiding her slightly backward. Ranger growled, not aggressive but protective, low and steady. His eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They locked onto something none of them could see. Daniel's heart pounded in his ears. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a criminal they had a description for. This wasn't a case they understood. This was something unknown, something hidden, something that seemed to be moving around them without stepping into the light. The girl leaned closer to Ranger. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. Ranger didn't move. The forest stayed silent. And then, softly, so softly Daniel almost thought he imagined it, a distant sound carried through the trees. The sound of a child's voice. Faint, muffled, calling for help. Daniel felt his breath stop in his chest. His hands shook. His heart cracked open with hope and fear in the same moment. But before he could run toward the sound, Ranger suddenly stepped sideways, blocking the path again, but this time with a forceful push that nearly knocked Daniel back. Whatever they heard, whatever was calling, Ranger didn't want them running toward it. Not yet. Not like this. Because something about that voice, something about the way it echoed, something wasn't right. And the truth behind it was far from what they expected. Ranger's body stayed tense. his stance unmoving as the faint voice drifted to the trees again. Daniel felt the sound pull at him like a rope tied around his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to run toward it, to chase it, to break through the branches and get to the sun as fast as his legs could carry him. But the dog's reaction stopped him cold. Ranger wasn't confused. He was warning them, and that warning felt heavier than the fading light around them. The little girl tightened her grip on the leash, her voice barely a whisper. That doesn't sound like before. Daniel swallowed hard. What do you mean? She took a shaky breath and looked at Ranger as if trying to read him. When Ranger finds someone, he usually pulls forward fast. He gets excited, but right now he's not excited. He's scared. The officers exchanged looks. None of them wanted to admit it, but they felt the same unease. The voice, soft, fragile, and calling out, should have filled them with hope. Instead, something about it felt off, like it wasn't coming from just one place, like it shifted slightly each time it echoed. Daniel listened again, but the sound faded into the trees like mist dissolving into air. He couldn't tell how far it was. Couldn't even tell which direction it came from. It was a kind of sound that pulled you in but kept slipping away the closer you got. And that uncertainty twisted something deep inside him. One officer stepped forward. Should we call for backup? Maybe do a wider search. We don't know what we're walking into, another muttered. This could be a trap or someone messing around. Daniel clenched his jaw. Nobody is playing games here. My son is missing. But, he looked at Ranger, we moved based on the dog, not the voice. That felt strange to say out loud, but it was true. Ranger knew something they didn't. The dog's instincts had already proven sharper than anything they had so far. Ranger paced in a slow circle, sniffing the air. His movements were tight, controlled, nothing like when he was excited. He stopped near a fallen log and lowered his head, sniffing at a spot where the soil looked disturbed. The girl knelt beside him again. What is it? Daniel asked, crouching next to her. The girl ran her hand lightly over the ground. Someone was here recently. Look, the dirt is loose and there's a footprint. Daniel leaned closer. It was small, not a child's, but smaller than an adult man's boot. Maybe a teenager. Maybe someone trying to stay hidden. The print wasn't clear enough to identify, but the shape was enough to raise questions. Could it have gone this way? One officer asked. Maybe, Daniel said, but we need more than a maybe. Ranger sniffed again, then lifted his head and stared into the darker part of the woods. He didn't move. He didn't bark. He just stared, his body rigid and protective. Daniel followed Ranger's gaze and saw nothing but shadows, tree trunks, and a dim outline of a narrow path curling deeper into the forest. He hadn't noticed it before. It blended in almost too well, like it wasn't meant to be found. The girl tugged gently on the leash. Ranger knows something is out there, she whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. Then we need to know, too. They walked forward, but only a few steps, because as soon as they reached the edge of the path, the air shifted. It wasn't a sound, not a voice, just a feeling, like someone exhaling softly right beside them. Daniel stopped instantly, scanning the trees. Do you feel that? He asked the nearest officer. Yeah, the officer murmured, like someone's close. Ranger growled, a low, steady sound that vibrated through the silence. The girl moved closer to Daniel, instinctively. Then, suddenly, a twig snapped somewhere behind them. Everyone turned at once, flashlights clicking on, beams slicing through the shadows. The light revealed nothing but trees and broken branches. No figure, no movement, just empty space. Yet the feeling of being watched grew thicker. One officer slowly walked toward the sound, shining the light around. If someone's there, step out. We just want to talk. No answer. The beam of the flashlight hovered over the trunk of a tall oak, then drifted lower. The officer froze. Sir, there's something here. Daniel hurried over, heart hammering. The officer pointed to a small piece of cloth snagged on the bark. It was torn, faintly dirty and barely hanging on. Daniel reached out and touched it gently. The fabric was familiar, too familiar. It's for my son's jacket, he whispered. A wave of emotion hit him like a punch to the chest. His legs almost gave out. He held the cloth tightly, breathing shakily. It was proof his son had been here. Proof Ranger was right. But it also meant his son had been deeper in these woods, alone or with someone else. The girl touched Daniel's arm softly. "We'll find him," she said, her voice sincere and steady. Daniel nodded, though his throat tightened. "We have to, before it gets darker." Ranger barked again, sharp and insistent. This time he pulled harder on the leash, tugging them back toward the main path through the trees. The girl stumbled but didn't let go. "Where's he taking us now?" an officer asked. "He's following the strongest scent," Daniel replied. "We trust him." Ranger led them deeper into forest, where the air grew cooler and the ground uneven. Shadows stretched across the trees like long fingers, and the sound of branches shifting overhead added to the tension. The officers kept their flashlights low, lighting the ground as Ranger moved faster, pulling the girl into a jog. Daniel stayed close. Every time the wind blew, he expected to hear the voice again, but the woods remained strangely quiet, as if listening. After a few minutes, Ranger slowed and stopped at a spot near a cluster of large rocks. He sniffed around, pacing in small circles. The girl looked uncertain. "What is it?" Daniel asked. The girl shook her head. "He's confused. The scent, it splits." "Splits?" Daniel repeated. "Yes," she said, pointing to two different directions. "He smells the same person going this way and that way." "That doesn't make sense," an officer muttered. Daniel stared at the two paths, both narrow, both dark. Which one is real? Ranger pawed at the ground, then looked up at Daniel helplessly. An expression Daniel had never seen on a trained police dog. It made something cold settle in his chest. "Someone tried to trick the trail," the girl whispered. "Someone dragged something, or someone two different directions." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. Someone had intentionally tried to confuse the scent. Someone who knew they were being followed. Someone who didn't want them finding the boy. The forest around them stayed silent, but the tension grew heavier. Daniel looked at the two paths again, then at Ranger, then at the far darkness beyond. "We're not alone here," he said quietly. And as soon as the words left his mouth, a soft whistle, sharp, sudden, unmistakably human, echoed through the trees. Not a bird, not the wind. A signal. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and the real danger was only beginning. Ranger snapped his head toward the direction of the whistle, his ears high, his entire posture locked in alarm. The little girl tightened her hold on the leash, but Ranger pulled forward a step, then stopped again, torn between instinct and caution. Daniel felt the tension coil inside him like a wire pulled to its breaking point. The whistle wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. Someone had sent that signal deliberately. Someone who knew they were close. The officers fanned out carefully, flashlights cutting across the trees in thin beams. Every rustle of leaves sounded sharper, every shifting shadow heavier. Daniel kept glancing between the two paths where the scent had split. Someone had created two false trails, and now the whistle from the darkness meant only one thing. They were being watched to see which path they would choose. The girl crouched beside Ranger, whispering to him. The dog didn't move. His chest rose and fell steadily, but his eyes stayed fixed on the deeper part of the forest. Daniel swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. Every second mattered, but every second also carried danger. The last thing he wanted was to run into a trap. But the idea of standing still while his son was somewhere out there, maybe scared, maybe hurt, made his heart ache. Another officer stepped closer to Daniel. It could be someone trying to scare us off. Daniel shook his head slowly. No, that whistle, it was meant to guide or warn. People want to scare, you don't stay hidden this long. The girl tugged lightly at Daniel's sleeve. Ranger wants to move, but he won't go unless you do. Daniel knelt beside the dog. Where is he telling us to go? Which path? Ranger sniffed the air again, but instead of choosing one of the trails, he turned his nose slightly upward toward the dark ridge beyond the rocks. Daniel lifted his flashlight, following Ranger's gaze. There wasn't a clear path there, just uneven ground thick roots and dense trees. The girl stood slowly. He smelled something higher up. One officer frowned. "There isn't a path over there." "Maybe not one for people," Daniel murmured. "But for whoever's been leading us around, maybe yes." Ranger took another step toward the ridge, then looked back at them as if urging them on. His movements were more confident than they had been at the split trail. The two paths on the ground might be decoys, but whatever he sensed above was real. Daniel nodded. "We follow him. Stay close. Watch your footing." They climbed carefully, the ground becoming steeper and the trees thicker. Branches brushed their shoulders, and the air grew colder. Every few seconds, someone would look over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear behind them. Daniel forced himself not to imagine it. He needed every bit of focus on the ridge ahead. Halfway up, Ranger suddenly halted again. Daniel froze instantly, hand falling to his side out of habit. The girl held her breath. The dog's nose twitched, and then he turned sharply toward the left. Daniel followed the direction and saw something pale sticking out between two tall roots. He moved closer. It wasn't clothing. It was a piece of paper. A note. His chest tightened as he reached for it. The edges were dirty. The ink smudged. One of the officers angled a light over Daniel's shoulder so he could read it. The message was short, shaky, and written in rushed handwriting. He was here, but he didn't stay. Someone took him further. Don't trust the sounds. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically, but emotionally. Someone else had been here. Someone who had tried to help. Someone who left a note as a warning. "Who wrote this?" an officer whispered. Daniel shook his head. "I don't know, but they wanted us to keep going." The girl touched the paper gently. "Maybe your son wasn't alone. Maybe someone found him." Daniel wanted to believe that, needed to believe that, but the fear in him still burned deeply. Someone had left a note, but someone else had created the false trails. Someone else had been moving just out of sight, and now the woods felt heavier with each passing second. Ranger barked sharply, breaking the silence. He moved again, climbing the last stretch of the ridge. Daniel followed, heart pounding. At the top, the ground flattened into a small clearing surrounded by tall rocks. The moon had risen enough to cast a faint glow through the branches, revealing something else. Disturbed grass, markings in the dirt, and the unmistakable sign that people had been there recently. Ranger sniffed along the edge of a rock, then stopped. He pressed his nose to the ground and let out a long, soft whine. Daniel rushed to his side. What did he find? What is it? The girl leaned in next to Ranger, eyes scanning the dirt. She gasped softly. "It's something from your son." Daniel saw it then, a small keychain lying half buried under the leaves. His son's favorite one, a gift from a school friend. Daniel picked it up slowly, his hands shaking. It felt warm from the ground, like it hadn't been there long. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it settle into him. "He dropped it," the girl whispered. "Maybe he tried to leave a trail for you." Daniel opened his eyes, but before he could respond, a sudden sound cut through the clearing, loud enough to jolt every officer into alertness. A branch snapped sharply in the distance. Then another. Ranger swung around, growling low, staring into the darkness beyond the clearing. Daniel moved closer to the girl protectively. Everyone stayed together. The officers positioned themselves, flashlights aimed toward the sound. The darkness seemed to pulse, moving with a strange rhythm, like someone was stepping carefully just out of sight. Then the voice came again, but this time it wasn't faint. It wasn't soft. It was closer, too close. "Help!" Daniel's heart stopped. It sounded exactly like his son. Exactly. But something in the tone, flat, almost too clean, made every instinct in him recoil. It felt like the voice was being echoed, repeated, or pulled from memory, not spoken from a real place. The girl shook her head slowly. "That's not him," she whispered. Daniel's breath trembled. "How can you tell?" "Because Ranger isn't pulling toward it," she said, voice barely audible. "He hears it too, but he's not moving." Ranger stood firm, staring at the trees, expression unwavering. If it were truly the boy, Ranger would have lunged forward like before. But he didn't. The voice called again, this time farther left, like it had shifted positions. Daniel felt a chill spread through his chest. Someone was mimicking his son. Someone who wanted them to follow. An officer whispered, "They're trying to draw us in." Daniel clenched his fists. Then they know we're close. Ranger barked once. Sharp, urgent. And then suddenly pushed forward toward a narrow passage between two rocks. The girl grabbed the leash and stumbled after him. Daniel followed instantly. "Go! Stay tight!" The officers rushed behind them, the forest echoing with quick footsteps, snapping twigs, and Ranger's determined breaths. The narrow passage led into a dark corridor of trees, where the air felt even heavier, like stepping into a different part of the forest entirely. Ranger ran faster, following something none of them could see. Daniel pushed forward, heart pounding, lungs burning, mind racing with hope and fear. Because whatever Ranger was chasing now, it wasn't a trick. It wasn't a false trail. It was real. And just ahead, hidden somewhere in the thick darkness, was the truth that would bring them face to face with the person who had taken his son. Ranger charged through the narrow passage between the rocks, his paws hitting the ground with rhythm that felt more urgent than anything before. Daniel pushed himself to keep up, his lungs burning as branches scraped against his arms. The officers followed in tight formation, flashlights shaking with every step. The little girl held onto Ranger's leash with both hands, trying not to fall as the dog pulled her deeper into the thick corridor of trees. The forest air grew heavier, cooler, almost as if they had crossed into a part of the woods untouched by the rest of the world. Daniel felt it immediately. The shift? It wasn't just darker. It was quieter. Too quiet. The kind of silence that didn't feel natural, as if the woods were holding their breath. "Stay close," Daniel called out, though his voice sounded strangely muffled in the stillness. Ranger suddenly slowed, sniffing the air with quick, sharp breaths. His tail lowered. His ears twitched, not toward one direction, but several, as if he sensed something coming from more than one place at once. The girl froze at his side, clutching the leash. "What's wrong with him?" one officer whispered. Daniel stepped in front of the girl protectively. "He's confused. Or he's detecting more than one scent." Before anyone could respond, another sound echoed through the trees. Not the voice. Not footsteps. A low mechanical hum. It was faint at first, like something powering up far away, but it grew steadily louder, vibrating through the ground. Ranger's ears flattened for a moment. Then he barked sharply, turning toward the right. The officers aimed their flashlights, but the beams barely cut through the thick layer of trees. The hum intensified, mixing with a strange clicking sound. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He had never heard anything like this in the forest. The girl tugged Daniel's sleeve. "Ranger doesn't like that sound." Daniel noticed it too. Ranger wasn't just alert. He was agitated. The trained K9 kept shifting his weight back and forth, tore between wanting to investigate and wanting to pull the group away. Then the hum stopped abruptly. The forest fell silent again. But now Daniel knew something was there. Something waiting. "Everyone move slowly," he whispered. Ranger took a cautious step forward, sniffing the ground. Daniel followed, eyes scanning the shadows. The girl stayed right beside Ranger, whispering softly to calm him. The officers moved in a slow circle around them, flashlights wide. A few steps later, Ranger stopped at a patch of disturbed leaves. Daniel crouched down and brushed them aside carefully. Beneath them was a long, thin scrape in the dirt, too smooth to be an animal track, too straight to be natural. It looked like something had been dragged, something heavy. Daniel's throat tightened. This wasn't made by a person walking. The girl knelt beside him. "It's from something rolling." Daniel looked at her sharply. "Rolling?" She nodded, like a small cart or wheels. The mechanical hum replayed itself in Daniel's mind. Wheels. Machinery. Someone had moved something or someone through this forest using equipment, not just footsteps. "Why would anyone do that?" one officer muttered. Daniel didn't have an answer, but his stomach twisted. This wasn't random. Someone had planned this. Someone had studied the woods, mapped them, prepared routes. Someone had made sure to stay ahead of them every step. Ranger suddenly turned again, this time toward a ridge on the opposite side. He barked urgently, but instead of pulling forward, he backed up slightly. The little girl whispered, "He smells someone close, but he doesn't trust it." Daniel's breath caught. Another voice? Before she could answer, a new sound drifted through the trees. A soft cry, not calling for help. Crying. A child sobs. Daniel's chest tightened instantly. He felt the world tilt. It sounded so real, so raw, so close that his legs nearly gave out. "That's him," he whispered. "That has to be him." But the girl didn't move. Ranger didn't move. And that was the second thing that made Daniel freeze. If the sound was truly his son, Ranger would have launched forward with everything he had. Instead, the dog lowered his head, sniffing the air with slow, suspicious breaths. Then he let out a quiet growl, stepping in front of Daniel as if shielding him. "Why isn't he running?" Daniel whispered. The girl swallowed hard. "Because the crying, it's not coming from just one place." Daniel blinked. "What?" She pointed around them, eyes wide. "Listen." Daniel held his breath. The crying echoed again, but this time it didn't come from the ridge. It came from behind them. Then again from the left. Then again from farther ahead. 3 different directions. 3 identical cries. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. His hands turned cold. This wasn't just someone mimicking a voice. This was something else entirely. Something calculated. Something designed to confuse them from every angle. And then Daniel noticed something worse. Each time the cry echoed, Ranger's ears moved differently. 1 twitch for the left, 1 flick for the right, 1 tilt forward. The dog didn't know where the real one was. Someone had used recordings, timed them, layered them, placed them around the forest. The officers exchanged looks of alarm. "That's impossible," one said under his breath, "unless someone planted devices out here." Daniel stared into the darkness. "Someone planned every sound we've heard." The girl held Ranger's collar tightly. "Someone didn't want you to find the right trail." Daniel felt anger rise in his chest. But why mimic a crying child? Why my son? Ranger suddenly jerked his head upward. Everyone followed his gaze. Above them, between the thick branches, something glinted. Daniel stepped closer, raising his flashlight. There, strapped high on a branch, was a small metal device, a speaker, and attached beside it was something else, a small piece of torn fabric, blue, from his son's shirt. Daniel's heart thudded painfully. They weren't just being misled. They were being watched so closely that someone placed clues where they knew he would find them. "Someone is controlling this whole forest," one officer muttered. "No," Daniel whispered, gripping the fabric with shaking hands. "Someone knows these woods better than anyone." Ranger barked sharply again, pulling toward the north edge of clearing. This time, there was no hesitation, no confusion. The scent that was strong, fresh, real. The dog's posture changed entirely, alert, urgent, determined. It was the first genuine trail they'd had since entering the forest. Daniel's heart pounded with a mix of hope and fear. "Let's move." But as they started forward, another sound cut through the night. A new voice. Deep, calm, human, from somewhere up ahead. "You should have turned back when you had the chance." Daniel froze. The officers snapped into defensive positions. The girl clutched Ranger's leash so tightly her knuckles turned white. And Ranger didn't bark. He didn't move. He stood perfectly still, staring into the darkness with a stillness Daniel had never seen in him before. Because the person who spoke wasn't far. They were close, very close, and they had been waiting for this moment. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, trying to understand what the little girl had just said. Her voice shook slightly, but the words she spoke carried a strange kind of certainty. She pointed toward the second door in the abandoned farmhouse, the one no one had opened yet. Max lowered himself toward the ground, nose twitching, ears forward, his body stretched tight like a drawn bow. The air felt heavier, as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for someone to make the next move. The officer who had just arrived took a slow step forward, his hand resting on the little girl's shoulder. She didn't move away this time. Instead, she just stared at the door, as if she already knew what they were about to discover. The old wooden floor creaked beneath their weight, and the sound echoed through the walls. Daniel gently pushed the door, but it didn't budge. It seemed locked from the inside. Max let out a low, frustrated whine, tapping the floor once with his paw, as if urging them to hurry. Another officer rushed in and helped force the door. The lock snapped with a sharp metallic crack. As the door swung open, a thin beam of light cut into the dark room. Dust floated through it like drifting snow. Daniel stepped inside first, followed by the others. The air was thick and stale, carrying a faint smell of old paper and something else, something familiar but hard to place. Then they saw it. A small desk was pushed against the far wall, and on top of it was a stack of photos. They weren't random. They were pictures of the officer's missing son, taken at different times, different locations, as if someone had been quietly watching him. The officer's breath hitched, and for a second, he couldn't step closer. His face went pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. Daniel picked up the photos one by one. Max sniffed each image carefully, lingering on the last one longer than the rest. The photos showed the boy standing near a large storage shed, something wooden and old, surrounded by tall grass. It didn't look like any place Daniel recognized. But the little girl stepped closer, lifting her chin as if she had just remembered something important. "I've seen that place," she whispered. Her words hit the officer like a shock. He turned to her, trying not to overwhelm her, but his voice cracked. He needed to know everything. She hesitated for a second before explaining that she had been brought to a place that looked just like the one in the photo. She didn't know where it was, but she remembered the wind, the trees, and a distant sound of running water. Daniel exchanged a quick look with the officer. There was a river just outside the old rural limits, a place barely anyone visited anymore. Max paced in circles, sniffing the air, tail stiff with alertness. It was as if he could feel the truth settling in the room. They raced outside with the little girl, guiding them as best as she could. The cold night air hit their faces, but no one slowed down. The sky was dark, but the moonlight cut across the fields enough to show their path. Max ran ahead, nose close to the ground, body tense, tracking something invisible to them, but strong enough to pull him forward. As they moved deeper into the land, the sound of the river grew clearer. The tall grass brushed against their legs. The little girl tugged on Daniel's sleeve, pointing toward a cluster of old wooden sheds near the water. Max suddenly stopped, turned sharply, and bolted toward the largest shed. The officer sprinted after him, every emotion he had been holding back breaking loose. Max clawed at the shed door, barking sharply, urgently, as if he already knew what was inside. Daniel and the other officers forced the door open. The inside was dim, lit only by a small gap in the roof where moonlight streamed through. And there, sitting on the ground with his knees pulled against his chest, was the officer's son. The boy lifted his head slowly, blinking at the sudden light. His face was tired, frightened, but unharmed. Max rushed to him immediately, whining softly, pressing his head into the boy's shoulder. The officer dropped to his knees, pulling his son into his arms, overwhelmed with relief. The boy held on tightly, trembling. But just as they thought everything was over, a sound came from behind the shed, a slow, dragging noise across the dry leaves. Daniel's heart pounded again, realizing someone else might be there. The little girl stepped behind him instinctively, her small hand gripping his jacket. The officers drew closer to the corner of the shed, senses sharp, expecting someone dangerous to emerge. But when the figure stepped into view, it wasn't the person they imagined. It was another child, a boy around the same age as the girl, wearing clothes that were dirty and torn, his eyes deep with fear, but also recognition. He stared at the girl for a long moment, and she gasped softly. Daniel could see it clearly. She knew him. The boy took a cautious step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "I tried to help you, but they made me run." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move toward him. She looked at Daniel instead, as if she needed reassurance that it was safe. The officer holding his rescued son stood up slowly, realizing this new child might be connected to the entire mystery. Before anyone could say more, Max turned again, ears pinned back, looking toward the dark line of trees behind the shed. His body stiffened, and he growled, not in fear, but in warning. Someone else was out there. Daniel felt the tension rise again, sharper than before. They had found the officer's son, uncovered old secrets, and brought another lost child into the light. But the real person behind everything, the one who had been controlling it all from the shadows, had not revealed themselves yet. The leaves rustled again. Every officer raised their light, their breaths held in unison. And just before the figure stepped out of the darkness, the little girl whispered the same words that had started everything. "My police dog can find him too." And then the shadow moved. The shadow moved forward slowly, and for a moment, no one breathed. The wind rustled through the trees. The shed creaked behind them, and Max inched ahead, keeping his body low but his stance protective. When the figure finally stepped into moonlight, it wasn't the dangerous stranger they had all pictured. It was an older man, thin and tired-looking, his hands raised slightly as if he had already accepted whatever might come next. Daniel's grip tightened on his flashlight, unsure what the man would do. But the little girl surprised everyone by taking a small step forward, staying behind Daniel but no longer hiding completely. Her face softened with something between shock and recognition. The older man looked at her with sadness that felt heavier than the night around them. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the man said quietly. "I couldn't stop them, but I tried to keep the place safe. I knew someone would come for the children eventually." The officers exchanged confused glances. Max stopped growling but stayed alert, his eyes locked on the man. The officer whose son had been found kept his arm wrapped protectively around the boy, watching closely. The newly found boy stood beside the little girl now, both of them listening carefully. Daniel stepped forward slowly, keeping his voice calm. "Who are you, and what happened here?" The man lowered his hands, trembling slightly. "My name is Thomas. I worked on this land years ago, before all of this. When certain people began using the old buildings for things they shouldn't, they paid me to keep quiet. I knew it was wrong, but I also knew I wasn't strong enough to fight them. But the children, I couldn't just leave them alone. I hid them when I could, helped them escape when there was a chance. I kept watch from the woods, hoping someone else would find them before things got worse." The little girl's eyes glistened. She remembered a gentle voice that had told her to wait for the right moment. The night she tried to escape. She didn't know who it was at the time, but now it made sense. Daniel studied Thomas carefully. The man didn't look like someone who had power over anyone. He looked like someone who had lived too long with regret. The officers questioned him further, and his answers matched details the children had already shared. The hidden paths, the strange noises at night, the way the kids were moved from place to place. Thomas admitted everything. How he had tried to protect them in small ways, how he had left clues unnoticed by the very people he feared, and how he'd heard Max's barking earlier that night, and knew this was finally the turning point. With the children safe and the immediate danger gone, the officers made a decision to take Thomas in for further questioning. He didn't fight it. In fact, he seemed relieved. Before he was escorted away, he looked at the little girl with an expression filled with apology. She didn't speak, but she nodded slightly, a quiet sign that she understood more than anyone expected. Once Thomas was gone, the scene grew calmer. The officer hugged his son again, overwhelmed with gratitude and relief. The boy clung to him, breathing steadily for the first time in days. Daniel led the little girl and the other rescued child toward the patrol vehicles, keeping his pace slow, so they wouldn't feel rushed. Max trotted beside them, his tail finally relaxing into a gentle wag. He brushed his head against the girl's hand, and she smiled softly, touching his fur like she had been waiting to do that since the moment they met. In that small gesture, Daniel understood just how much trust she had placed in the dog from the very beginning. When they reached the patrol cars, the rising sun began to touch the horizon with pale orange light. It warmed the cold air, and for the first time that night, everyone could breathe without the weight of fear pressing on them. The officers wrapped blankets around the children and made sure they had water and something warm to drink. The girl sat quietly beside Max, and the boy sat near her, leaning slightly as if her presence helped him steady himself. Daniel crouched down to meet the girl's eyes. "You were very brave," he said. "You helped us find them. And you helped Max more than you know." She looked at him thoughtfully. Then at Max. "He listened to me," she said softly, "like he already knew what I needed him to do." Daniel smiled. "He's good at that. He understands people." The officer whose son had been rescued approached them, still holding back tears. He knelt beside the girl and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I can never thank you enough," he said. "You changed everything tonight." The girl looked down for a moment, then spoke so quietly that Daniel almost missed it. "I just didn't want anyone else to be alone." Her words settled over them like a soft blanket. Simple, honest, and heavier than anyone expected. Daniel realized then that this story wasn't just about a missing child or a brave police dog. It was about connection, about people finding each other even in the darkest moments. It was about a little girl who believed in a police dog enough to guide a broken officer back to hope. As the sun climbed higher, the officers prepared to take everyone back to station. The girl and the boy were placed in safe custody, where specialists could care for them and help them heal. The officer drove his son home, taking slow turns as if making sure the world around him was real and not just a dream. Before everyone left, the girl turned and looked at Max one more time. The dog lifted his head proudly, as if acknowledging her silent goodbye. She gave him a small smile, the kind that said she felt safe now, the kind that promised she wouldn't forget him. Daniel stood beside Max, watching the patrol cars roll away. The field was quiet again, but it no longer felt haunted. It felt like a chapter closing gently, making room for something new. He rested his hand on Max's back. "Good work, partner," he whispered. Max leaned into him, tail swaying, eyes calm. The night had tested them all, pushed them into places they didn't expect to go, but had also shown something important. Courage isn't always loud. Heroes aren't always grown, and sometimes the most powerful guidance comes from the least expected voice. The story of the little girl, the officer, and the police dog who found a missing boy would stay with them forever, not because of the danger or the fear, but because of the hope that rose from it. Hope that reminded everyone watching that even in the darkest moments, kindness can spark the way forward. And while the world moved on, one thing stayed certain. Max, the police dog who followed a child's quiet instinct, had once again proven that some bonds, especially the ones formed in moments of truth, are unbreakable.